Earlier this week, the Democratic primary challenger, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., appeared on the online show Breaking Points, hosted by two very good journalists, Krystal and Sagar and Jetty. And I found this interview very illuminating for multiple reasons, and it attracted a lot of attention, especially the segment that we will show you and break down, in which Krystal confronts RFK Jr. about what she calls either his vaccine skepticism or his anti-vax sentiment. And he does a good job of using the time she gave him to respond. And what I found very interesting about this interview, well, it was several things, including the fact that she told him she regards his views on vaccines to be not merely an issue with which she and many other Democratic voters strongly disagree, but for her, a quote, red line, meaning that anyone who crosses into that territory specifically is one that she considers essentially off limits. It's a red line. Once you cross it, there's no coming back. And because this is a dynamic I have long noticed, starting with the 2012 presidential election, as I alluded to, between Barack Obama and Ron Paul, which I want to break down in terms of why that first attracted my attention, and the broader tactic, which I'm not saying Krystal invoked, but certainly is often invoked in the context of RFK or Ron Paul, or people who are just a little bit outside of establishment thought, of calling them crazy or declaring them too strange, too unhinged, and too bizarre. It's a very common and potent tactic, and I think it's one that you will find is only wielded by the establishment against critics of the establishment. In other words, establishment figures have all the space in the world to endorse the most deranged, the most unhinged, the craziest policies. But as long as you're in alignment with establishment orthodoxy, you will never be declared crazy, no matter how crazy those ideas are. This is a term, this is a tactic reserved only for those who question prevailing establishment orthodoxy, and I think all of us are, in a way, vulnerable to it. It's a very potent and pervasive form of propaganda that requires our constant vigilance, and if we let our guard down at all, we're all susceptible to being influenced by that, to think, no, that person has taken a view that everyone just knows is wrong. Everyone trustworthy and reliable and credible knows is wrong, and therefore I just want to stay as far away from them as possible. I think analyzing how this tactic is wielded, how it manifested here, is of the utmost importance. Now, just a few cards on the table before I go show you the parts of the interview and dissect it and connect it to other events. I consider both Krystal and Sagar and Jetty to be good friends of mine. I've appeared on that show many times. I have a lot of respect for their work. This is a case where I'm going to express some disagreements with Krystal's views, but it's not because I think she is a poor journalist or somebody ill-motivated. Quite the contrary. I think the fact that she is someone who is often very rigorous and scrupulous in trying to guard against establishment propaganda, yet nonetheless in this case used a tactic that is usually a tool of the establishment. And Breaking Points is a show that has succeeded because it is anti-establishment, is what makes it particularly worthwhile. If this had been Anderson Cooper or Joe Scarborough or Chris Hayes or any of those kinds of people, it would have been unworthy of analysis because that's what you expect from them. So I think the fact that it came from an anti-establishment venue makes it all the more illustrative. And I also just want to note that we have been in contact with RFK Jr. about appearing on the show. He's agreed to do so. We're just negotiating exactly the date on which he will appear. I hope to devote an entire show to him, or most of our show to him, like we did with Marianne Williamson, like we did with Vivek Ramaswamy, like we intend to do with any of the presidential candidates who will come to our show. I'm definitely interested in talking to him, and we will be doing that very soon, although he's by far from a candidate that I support. He has all kinds of views with which I vehemently disagree, including his ardent support for most of the extremist expressions of Russiagate. So he's clearly not my candidate. I'm nonetheless interested in this dynamic because of what it illustrates more broadly. It's a really perfect, vivid illustration of this tactic that I think deserves a lot of attention. It's often overlooked, and like I said, many of us ingest it almost reflexively. So let's go ahead and take a look at the segment of this interview where vaccines were discussed. It's about 10 minutes long. We're going to show you just a couple of segments, and I'll comment on the parts that I think merit comment as we go along and kind of explain the framework that I want to explore with it.
About vaccines, this is an area where you and I have significant differences. And, just to level with you on this, like a lot of what you say I really respond to. I think you're a very genuine person, but the across the board, whether you want to call it vaccine skepticism or anti-vax advocacy, which has been a central part of what you've been up to for the past number of years. For me personally, it's an issue, and it's a real sort of red line. And I know I'm not alone in that, especially running in a Democratic primary. There are going to be other millions of people.
Okay, so there you heard what she said, that this is not just an issue with which she disagrees with him, but it's for her, and she surmises, I think correctly, for a lot of other Democratic voters, a red line. Now, I don't want to place huge amounts of meaning in that phrase where it comes to Krystal, because she's speaking here live and without a script. And I know as well as anybody how sometimes you don't express yourself in the most precise way, that you use phrases or words that you wouldn't use if you were sitting and contemplating exactly what you wanted to say. But the fact that she did say it, and you could kind of see the progression of her thought where she told him, for me, your view of vaccines is very wrong. In fact, it's a red line. I think it was very telling. She wanted to make the point that this is not just an ordinary disagreement she has with him. This is something that, for her, despite all the other things he says that she says resonates with him, places him in this kind of different off-limits category. I've never heard her say that about Joe Biden. I believe she supported Joe Biden in the 2020 election, most definitely not in the primary. She, I believe, was a Bernie Sanders supporter. That's for sure. She did not support him in the primary, but certainly in the general election, that was her preferred candidate. I have not heard her say that positions Joe Biden has taken is a red line for her, where she would never support him in a way she seems to be saying here for RFK Jr. when it comes to vaccines. So that's part of what attracted my attention. Let's listen to the rest.
Like me who have similar concerns. So how do you win them over? What's your message to people who think like I do?
Well, but just tell me where you think I got it wrong.
Well, I think you get it wrong when you draw a correlation between the rise of things like autism and the introduction of vaccines when there isn't hard scientific evidence tying those things together.
How do you know? Let me ask you this. How do you know there's not a hard scientific evidence?
Well, because the one major study that purported to show that was retracted, and the scientist who conducted it was,
Now, what you're doing now,
basically
Krystal,
fraudulently created. Listen,
no.
Hold on.
You're
but
raising
I don't want to get in a debate with you about this because you've spent your life pulling out this study. Now, I will tell you. Let me just tell you.
Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds.
Let me just tell you.
I've
listened to hours of interviews with you with an open mind, and I'm not persuaded. Now, maybe I'm wrong. That's possible. I'll hold it out there. People can watch. I thought Megyn Kelly did a phenomenal interview with you that went through all these claims piece by piece by piece. I really encourage people to watch that whole exchange because we won't be able to do it justice here in the 5 minutes we have left. But there are going to be people like me who aren't persuaded and who see this as an issue. And the fact that it's been such a central part of your advocacy means I can't just sort of put it to the side and say, oh, well, I'll just ignore, this piece that's been really important to you in your life. So you're running in a Democratic primary. You have a lot of people who feel even more strongly than me who think that, Dr. Fauci is a hero and all of these things. How are you going to persuade them? How are you going to reach them? And what is your message to them?
Well, first of all, I'm not leading with, my opinions about vaccines. But what I say to people is show me where I got it wrong. Show me where I got my science wrong. I've written books about this. I wrote a book about the link between thimerosal and autism that has, I think, 450 distilled scientific studies that confirm and validate that.
All right, so there's a lot going on there that I think is worthy of attention. So first of all, you can see that Krystal is explicitly acknowledging that she doesn't have the same level of information and knowledge. She hasn't devoted anywhere near the amount of time to this question as RFK Jr. And for that reason, she's explicitly saying, I don't want to actually engage with you on the merits. she keeps trying to kind of switch the question to a political or punditry question of, well, look, right or wrong, there's a lot of Democratic voters out there who share my views, who think you're wrong on vaccines. How do you intend to persuade them? But he wants, rightly so, after having been accused of being wrong on vaccines, to hear from her what the basis is for her view that he's wrong. He wants to engage the substantive debate. That's part of why he's running. And I think he goes on to say to her that he, after listening to her try and mount the case, that she's parroting establishment outlets, that she's parroting what the health establishment and what health policy officials have just repeated over and over, to the point that I think even well-intentioned people like Krystal start absorbing it to be true. And this is what I think is such an important point. I think in order to have a public platform where you opine strongly on vital issues, like whether the benefits of vaccines have been oversold, whether their harms and risks have been minimized and concealed, I really think you have an obligation to have that opinion be steeped in some very in-depth knowledge. And I've tried very hard in my journalistic career never to opine publicly unless I feel I have that kind of a basis of information. That's one of the reasons why I've always confined myself to a few issues at a time. One of my concerns with doing a show like this nightly, and I talked about this a lot with my team, was how am I going to do a show where I have to talk every night about 9 or 10 or 12 issues where my knowledge about it is superficial. And so one of the things we decided was we're not going to talk about 9 or 12 issues every day. I'm not going to be obligated to opine publicly or journalistically or assert claims when I have just an ordinary level of knowledge, no deeper or more developed than the ordinary person who has a full-time job that requires them to work on non-political issues. And so if you're going to come and tell Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to his face that he's not only wrong when it comes to vaccine skepticism, but so wrong that it's crossed over this red line, then I do think you have the obligation to be prepared to engage on the merits and to construct an argument. She does go on to say, look, I may be wrong on this. This is something that I am open to being persuaded on, but I've listened to you and I haven't been persuaded. But she also says that she doesn't really have anywhere near the level of knowledge he has. He spent years working on this. Remember, RFK Jr. was, for 20 years or so, a very widely regarded environmental activist, working on issues of harmful waste by corporations and toxic dumping. He's somebody who's a very serious person. He is not some, extremist or marginalized figure who just emerged out of the blue and started, for clicks or attention, talking about vaccines. This is a very deeply developed view, which does not mean I agree with it. I don't have the knowledge to agree with it or not, but what I know is this. Health officials in the United States and in the West were proven to be not just wrong, but dishonest repeatedly throughout the COVID vaccine. Starting with the very first week, when Dr. Fauci received emphatic emails from some of the most well-regarded virologists and epidemiologists on the planet, telling him that they were very convinced that the novel coronavirus could not have emerged naturally or through species jumping, but almost certainly came from a lab in Wuhan that happened to be one that received funding from agencies supervised by Dr. Fauci. And for obvious reasons, Dr. Fauci was highly motivated to destroy and crush any possibility that this pandemic came from risky research that he himself approved and funded. And so within a matter of a week, the entire establishment got on board with the view that he insisted they endorse, which was that the notion that this came from another species and jump species or evolved naturally was all but proven, while the possibility of a lab leak was debunked. We know that that was completely baseless at best. To the point where, for a year or so, Facebook and other social media companies barred anyone from questioning it. That's how powerful Dr. Fauci was in creating a false consensus. You couldn't even question what he was saying, let alone did you have people willing in public to say he was wrong, only for the US government itself to finally get to the point that they said they didn't know the origins of the coronavirus and that an investigation was needed, including to consider the possibility of a lab leak. And now, as we know from the Wall Street Journal and other outlets, the most elite scientific units and teams in the Department of Energy and in the FBI believe that a lab leak from the Wuhan lab is not only plausible, something you weren't allowed to say as a result of Dr. Fauci, but is the most probable explanation for where the coronavirus came from. You certainly have other experts who dispute that, but the debate is open, and yet Dr. Fauci from the beginning closed it. We also know that all kinds of claims about the Pfizer vaccine and other vaccines were false to the point of being just deceitful. There's famous clips of people they send to propagandize the public, Rachel Maddow and others, but Dr. Fauci himself saying that the vaccine prevents transmission, that if you're vaccinated, you cannot contract or transmit the virus to others. And then 2 months later, we watched as millions of vaccinated people were contracting and transmitting the virus to other vaccinated people, something that turned out to be a complete lie, and on and on and on and on. So whether I'm persuaded or not by what RFK Jr. has to say about vaccines, both generally and when it comes to the COVID vaccine, I know for sure we benefit from having these questions debated. That's the reason the DNC wants to pretend RFK Jr. doesn't exist. They're petrified of him for reminding Americans not only of how much we were deceived on almost every aspect of the COVID pandemic, including the vaccines, but how much damage that has done from all the policies that we enacted based on these false claims, from school closings that have destroyed the social and intellectual development of huge numbers of our nation's youth and youth around the world, to skyrocketing rates of depression and suicide and alcohol and drug abuse, which came from the harms of isolation and shutdowns and so many other things. So at the very least, I think that if you have a public platform, you have a responsibility to encourage and cheer for and want to foster debate on these most critical questions, especially when it comes from highly informed people who are challenging and dissenting from establishment orthodoxy, especially on debates where they have been proven over and over to lie and to be proven wrong. And so Krystal Ball has every right to insist that she disagrees with RFK's skepticism on vaccines. But I think if you're going to use your public platform to say that, as opposed to just believing that privately, which we all have to do, we all have to form opinions privately, but it's a big jump to say, I'm going to use the privilege and the responsibility I have with my public platform to opine on issues that I really haven't done the work necessary to have a reliable opinion. Then I think the only default position there is, if you're going to comment on those issues without the sufficient knowledge, is to encourage skepticism, to say, I want to hear these debates. We need more transparency and more of a right to have these questions raised, rather than telling somebody that they're not only wrong, but so wrong that they've crossed a red line, which is completely in alignment with what the DNC is trying to do. To say that both Marianne Williamson and RFK Jr. don't even deserve to be heard. They don't even deserve to be considered primary opponents to Joe Biden. If you ask a DNC official, they'll say it's already done. Biden has no primary challenger. He's our nominee, without a single vote being casted, without any debate being held, precisely because what their strategy is to encourage people to believe that RFK Jr. is not just wrong, but so wrong that no matter how much else you might like him on other issues, such as his vehement opposition to the proxy war in Ukraine, that he shouldn't even be someone that you're willing to get near. He crossed a red line. This is the establishment tactic that I think Krystal Ball in this case, and so many other people in so many other cases, have unwittingly and with good motives propagated. It's almost subconscious. She believes this. I'm sure she's done the hours of work she said she did, but hours of work on a question this complex is nowhere near enough to opine that emphatically and to tell someone they're off limits, that they've crossed a red line. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.